Hi and welcome back. This is my fourth video in my Paint With Me series where I'm transforming this particular end table / side table through the power of paint. I'm walking you through each step. We already prepped and cleaned our piece, we primed our piece, and we have painted our piece. I used Chippy Barn Ambulante Decor paint on this particular piece and it's looking good. It did take me 3 coats of paint, but now we're ready for the next step, which is distressing. To distress or not distress? That is the question of many people who are painting a piece of furniture. I am not somebody that does a lot of distressing on my pieces of furniture. However, the pieces of furniture that I'm painting are old pieces and I'm not trying to make them look new. I want them to have that old feel, I want them to have that character, and I think distressing can really help you achieve that. I consider myself a minimal distresser. There are people out there that heavily distress. If I want that heavily distressed look, a lot of times I'll use a different kind of paint. There are essentially 2 different kinds of distressing. There is dry distressing and wet distressing. And I am someone that just prefers to do dry distressing, and that's what I'm gonna do on this particular piece. I am gonna talk just a little bit about wet distressing so that if that's something that you choose to do, or if that's something that you wanna try, I can kind of give you the basics, but I feel like it almost needs its own video. So again, there's dry distressing and wet distressing. Dry distressing is when you're distressing your piece once it's already dry. And I prefer this type of distressing. I feel like I have a lot of control over the situation. You use a fine grit sandpaper to achieve the look that you want. And how much you distress, again, is a personal choice, and how much you want to distress. So to distress or not distress, how much do I distress? Again, it's just personal choice. I am going to do just minimal distressing on this particular piece. I generally distress for 2 reasons. 1, I don't want it to look so brand new, and 2, when I want to bring out the details of a piece, and I think it's going to be perfect for this one because of the raised panel doors that we have. So there are basically 2 types of distressing. There's dry distressing and wet distressing. I am someone that likes to do the dry distressing, and that is when you are sanding your piece once it's dry. And wet distressing is when you are distressing your piece when it's not completely dry, or sometimes I'll do it when it is dry, but I will activate the paint. I think that's probably the best way to describe it, by getting it wet. Generally when I wet distress, I'm doing that when I have used milk paint or chalk paint. And those are not 2 types of paint that I use all that often, which is why I typically am not doing a lot of wet distressing. But you can wet distress with other types of paints as well, but I just feel like those work the best for me. And again, a lot of furniture painting is all about personal choices. I'm going to dry distress this piece, but let's talk a little bit about the wet distressing. Wet distressing, I use a lint-free I use a lint-free cloth. Typically, I have 3 kids and then myself and my husband, so there's usually old t-shirts that are ready to be recycled, mismatched socks. Today I actually have an old cloth diaper and a bottle of water. I am going to not talk a ton about wet distressing because I feel like it needs a video of its own, and I'll do that again in the future. So let's get to this particular piece where we're going to dry distress. So dry distressing is once your piece is dry, and again, I don't do a ton of distressing on my pieces. I like them just to look a little bit worn and just kind of bring out the character. And in order to do that, I use a fine grit sanding block. Now I have used this sanding block before, but I do love these sanding blocks. I usually get a multi-pack where there's a fine grit, a medium grit, and then the coarser grit. And these are washable, so probably after today I'm gonna wash this particular one because it's ready for it. Well, for this particular piece, I'm going to be distressing on the edges where you most likely would get wearing, natural wearing, and then I'm going to be distressing the front panels because I think that that's going to bring out the detail of the piece. On this particular piece, I primed it because I was concerned about 1, the bleed through of the piece, and 2, I was concerned about the coverage because we were going from that really dark piece to a very much lighter piece. So at this point, as I'm distressing, this is where when I'm sanding it and I'm getting down to the wood, that I'm gonna see that primer pop through. Since we used white primer and our piece is white, we're not gonna notice that. But if I were to have used different color or a darker color, especially as I'm sanding down and I'm getting to the wood, that's when the white's gonna peek through. And that's why we would want to have used shellac versus using a traditional white primer. So some people know ahead of time that they want to do the distressing on their piece of furniture, and they will apply a resist. A resist is a barrier that you're creating between the piece of furniture and your paint, and the resist is done before you get started painting. What they do is they take this waxing puck, or I've seen people use old candles. You could use soap and Vaseline. If I'm going to do that, which I rarely do that, I just use the waxing puck. I do have one in my arsenal of products. And what you do is you just rub that along the edges, which you know you're gonna wanna distress. And when you go back to distress it, it prevents the paint from really adhering to your piece. Your fine grit sandpaper, it's just gonna make it that much easier for the paint to come off. You're gonna notice as we're distressing this piece, it really doesn't take a lot of elbow grease, which is one of the reasons why I don't feel it necessary to do a resist or to take that extra step in the process. All right, I am going to get sanding on this piece, and it's just a little bit of pressure here. I don't always make a solid line of distressing, so I might distress right here and then jump over here and do some, and then jump over here. Again, how much you distress is completely up to you. There you have it. I have distressed my piece. Some of the other things I wanted to point out is that I don't try to make the distressing even. So I'm not necessarily trying to match up the left side to the right side. I do try to make sure that I have balanced my distressing so that I haven't distressed one side of the piece more than the other. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to clean this piece off. I'm going to brush it off, and then I'm going to wipe it off. And my next step is that I am going to be sealing this piece. Whenever you distress a piece, you're breaking the seal of the paint on the particular piece that you're working on. So I think that it is really important that you seal it. We're going to be talking about that next week. I'm going to talk about different ways to seal your piece, my favorite products, and then we'll be one step closer to finishing this project. So if you enjoyed this video and you found it to be somewhat helpful, or you'd like to follow along in my series, I would ask that you like this and subscribe to my channel. In the future, I plan on doing more Paint With Me series, as well as product reviews, tips and tricks, and other things related to furniture painting.